Okay, welcome everyone back at our Polycon UK webinar seminars. Today we have a pleasure of hosting Pauline Grosjean from University of New South Wales. The title of the presentation is Political Trenches, War, Partisanship and Polarization. This is a joint work with Saumitra, Yves Zenou and Michael Vlassopoulos. Michael is also with us today, so he agreed to look at the chat. So please use the chat if you have any questions that can wait. Our format is as usual, so the whole event is 1 hour, but we tend to reserve about 10 minutes at the end to questions and answers. So if you need to ask a clarifying questions, please do so during the talk. Unmute yourself and ask. If it can wait, then either ask in the chat or wait towards the end of the talk. Let me also remind you about our next event, which is not in 2 weeks. It's in 3 weeks, on the 20th of May. We have Violetta Judah from Chicago. Okay, Pauline, the floor is yours. Let's get started.
Thank you so much, and thanks for having me in this online seminar. So you've already announced the title, so I'm going to talk today about political trenches, and as you'll see, there's 2 meanings to this. First, we will see how politics was made in the trenches of World War I, and then we're going to see that this translated into a phenomenon of political entrenchment, i.e. persistent local political division between groups that then lead to political violence during World War II. So the broad motivation for this work has to do with polarization, partisanship, segregation, on which there has been a lot of recent literature and which are understood to be phenomena that are threats to liberal democracies. So I give here just a few examples of the literature that describe polarization, political polarization, and increased partisanship as fueling mistrust, prejudice, and hostility between groups. There is also some work that shows that if people are increasingly partisan, their authoritarianism can become attractive to them if these authoritarian leaders offer policies that are more aligned with their partisan interests. And overall, this kind of deleterious political environment can escalate into violence and civil war. And we also know from, again, recent work, in particular having to do with the rise of extremist populist parties, that this dynamics is particularly problematic when there is salient economic and cultural divides between groups, and in particular when you have a new political offer that addresses these divides. So what we're going to study is not the present-day environment, but that of the 1930s in Europe, where we see really similar dynamics, in particular between the left and the right, that are increasingly polarized and radicalized over the course of the 1930s. And it's interesting because we're going to study basically a setting where World War I, where we have a new political ideology, which is socialism, which is non-mainstream, and that addresses economic needs that are not necessarily addressed by existing parties. So I give here a few examples of the type of polarization and partisanship that were very salient in the 1930s. So in France in 1936, there is the election of a socialist and Jewish prime minister, Léon Blum, and this really galvanized the right, who really rallies around the slogan that they'd rather have Hitler than Blum. And actually, this wish is exhausted a few years later when France's longest-lived democratic regime, the Third Republic, commits suicide and puts in place a regime that will collaborate with Nazi Germany and a new authoritarian regime until France's liberation by the Allies. So we know that we suspect that there is a dynamic between partisanship, polarization, and segregation, but it's very difficult to study this dynamic because of endogenous sorting. So we know that partisans may self-select across groups, and then by lack of contact, they're going to become increasingly polarized. But the problem is that this dynamic is endogenous. So people can self-select to live in different places. So this had been described in the case of the US as the big start. So Democrats going into some places and Republicans being in other places. And it can also be mimicked online by access to differential information. So there is work showing that there is media echo chambers, and so people don't have access to, people self-select into informational environments. So what we're going to use here is a historical context where we don't have sorting across partisan group. We have local exogeneity in assignment to partisan group that leads to political conversion. And that creates the dynamic between segregation and polarization because these groups are geographically distinct. And I'll come back to, so what we're going to use is we're going to use military assignment to different regiments that creates a number of local discontinuities in exposure to partisan peers in the regiment. So the idea is that, different municipalities get assigned to different regiments. One gets assigned to a left-wing regiment. The other one gets assigned to a majority right-wing regiment. And then they converge towards the opinion of these regiments. And so this creates a strong political conversion within the regiments, but no universal shift in partisanship that creates sharp local discontinuities in political preferences. So I'm going to go into detail about the process of political conversion, and I'm going to talk about the roles of information, material needs, and oblique versus horizontal transmission, i.e. what is transmitted by officers versus what is due to peer effects between soldiers themselves. But what's important to remember is that, before France, and I'm going to show you maps that shows that there is a local continuity in political preferences, but because different places get assigned to different regiments, this creates sharp local discontinuities that were not there before. And then we're going to find that these political values are become entrenched. And so you have these local discontinuities that persist over time. And then at these points of contention, we're going to see more fighting that is due to civil war fighting between the collaboration, who was collaborated with Nazi Germany, and the resistance group who were fighting against this. But mostly these groups, as I'll say, were fighting each other. And so we're going to see more of this infighting closer to the boundary between regiments that separates that used to separate partisan regiments, if you want. So the timing of all this, I think, again, is interesting because we're going to see that really there is no difference before World War I. And before World War I, socialism is really very much an urban movement that then gets transmitted to the rural countryside during World War I. And so the process that we convert also correspond in terms of the historical period as really the spread of socialism, but also the emergence of the left-right divide. So I think it's important to remember that recent literature very much looks at the political realignment from a left-right divide to a divide more based on social and identity issues. And the context that we look at is the reverse. So we look at a France that was divided and polarized and structured around social and identity issues. So, who was a monarchist, who was a Republican, who was very religious, who was not, who was more or less of an anti-Semite with the Dreyfus affair. So the divides were very much around social and identity issues. And World War I really corresponds historically to the emergence of the left-right political divide. So the political realignment to left-right issues that's going to structure French politics and most European politics until the 1990s. And actually, the timing of our effect is going to exactly correspond to this. So we're going to find timing of our effects that pretty much correspond to the time period when the left-right divide really is the force that structures French politics. Okay. So this is a short talk, and I don't want to go too much into all the literature on, that is adjacent to our paper, but there is a large literature on war and nation building. And if I want you to remember one thing from this talk is that I think there is this idea out there that war is good for nation building. So there is a lot of work, and, I think Mussolini was very much an advocate of this idea that a good war will make the nation come together, and will make people more homogeneous and will build this group identity. So there's been a lot of work, studying the different channels through which this is possible. So, formal education, conscript indoctrination, people coming together and through social contact theory becoming closer to each other. But despite all this evidence that conflict should be good for nation building, this is not really what we observe necessarily historically, where in fact we observe many cases of national disunity, political polarization, and even revolutionary activity that follows conflict. So Germany is a case of this, right? So there has been work that shows clearly that World War I is directly linked to the rise of the Nazis. So Dejuan and I'll have a paper in a political science journal that really shows the link between victimization in World War I and support for the Nazi Party. Italy is another example where there is work that shows the link between war, socialism, and then a reaction to this, the Red Scare. So this is, again, another idea of very deep polarization that follows conflict. And in more recent time, the Iraq War has been linked to this increased political divide in the US and polarization. And in fact, what we're going to find, kind of reconcile these two views, is that we're going to find that war does generate political solidarity within units, but can accentuate polarization between different units. And so the overall effect on national polarization is ambiguous. So again, in the case of France, this is very clear that that there is this idea out there that, I was taught at school that World War I is really what made the French nation, because all these different groups came in contact with each other, the people from Brittany, the people from Corsica, they met each other for the first time. So there is this idea that somehow World War I would have been a very much a nation building moment for France, who came out victorious on top of that, of the conflict, right? But yet what we observe is interwar France that degenerates into increasing levels of polarization. And then what historians have described as a long civil war that starts in 1934 and that lasts until 1944. And I will come back to this when we talk about the interwar results. And the rest I've said. So what we do in this paper relies a lot on the fact that we have very good data that enables us to study the process of political conversion during World War I, in the sense that there is an election immediately before the war and immediately after. So this is a legislative election that is held in April 1914, so first round, second round. We're going to look at the first round in April 1914. So this is just a few months before the war breaks out in August 1914. And this is an election according to the regular calendar. And an election should have been held 4 years later in 1918, but 1918, France is still at war. And in fact, the election is pushed back until full demobilization of France in November 1919. So, as you know, the war ends in 1918, but French soldiers stay mobilized for 1 year because the mobilization is aimed at keeping pressure on Germany to sign the Versailles Treaty. So French soldiers are, demobilization is almost entirely achieved in November 1919, and there is an election. And people cast their ballot in the municipality where they're registered. So soldiers go back home and they cast their ballot in November 1919. So it's also convenient for us that there is male suffrage until 1945 in France. And so we're really capturing the political preferences of the population that is exposed to the conflict military assignments that we're going to study. So we have data at a very granular level. France has had a lot of state capacity for a while, so there's very granular information. So we have data on elections and a lot of other outcomes at the municipal level. So to give you an idea, there is 85,000 municipalities overall in the EU. 35,000 of those are in France, so it's very granular. To give you an idea, in our mechanism sample, the regression discontinuity sample that we're going to study, and I'll tell you more about this, there is 181 voters in 1914, so male voters, so who are also pretty much of age of fighting in World War I. So there's 181 voters in 1914 and 150 voters in 1919. So it's a difference of 31 people. And on average, there's 30 deaths in the municipality in our sample. So it really seems that, first of all, they're very small. And then the numbers correspond also suggest that there is not much migration. And we're really capturing the preferences of the population exposed to the conflict. So we have a number of other data, including data on 1.3 million military fatalities of metropolitan French soldiers that we gathered and cleaned with Victor, and that we published in the data paper to make it accessible. Okay, so military recruitment in World War One. First of all, it matches the preferences of the voting population because it's universal. So, this is a European audience, so I don't think I need to insist too much on that. But when I give this for an American audience, I really try to make them understand that it's not just a few men that went to war. It's really most of the population. So it's, men between 20 and 48 years old. And as you know, France has had a natality problem for a while. So really they cannot spare any men because Germany has a lot more men than France. And so exceptions to the draft are very rare. So it's really, thinking of every man in France between 20 and 48 years old who's drafted into the army. We're not going to consider all the army, but the line infantry, and the reserve of the line infantry and the reserve of the reserves, etc. But we're not considering the artillery or other units, but 90% of the fatalities are in the infantry. So we're capturing most of the population drafted in the conflict. And so we're going to use the fact that recruitment is local in the sense that, one municipality is assigned to one bureau and one bureau forms one regiment. So, the timing of this, I think it's fine. I think I also want to say that these units, as opposed to German units, they're interchangeable. So they're not specialized. They're just simply numbered and they're supposed to be interchangeable. And actually, we see evidence that High Command rotates these units so as to maintain death rates, for example, as good as, as much as possible, constant across units to avoid, specific regions to be decimated compared to other ones. Okay, so this is the map of municipalities.
Can I ask a
Yeah.
short question about the people from outside of the mainland France?
Yeah, so I think this map is useful to understand how I treat them. I completely ignore them. So we
Okay.
consider people from metropolitan France. So each person in one of these little units that you can see, which is a municipality, is going to be assigned to a military region, which is the part in, black line. And they're going to fight in this regiment for all the duration of the conflict. Uh, People from outside France, they're in different regiments. So they're either, Frenchmen who are born abroad, they're in colonial infantry regiments together, Then local troops of Algerians, Moroccans, they have their own units. And they're not mixed in the same units. They might fight in the same battle, but they're not mixed in the same regiment at all. So what happens, I mean, I think your question is useful because we don't have mixing with troops from the colonial empire, but there is, after a while, mixing across region, right? So this is understood as an intention to treat, because recruitment is local in 1914, but increasingly, as there is more and more deaths, like maybe there is no more men from this region to put in that regiment. And so they start mixing troops, right? But at least for the first 2 years, they don't do that. They really do this when they don't have a choice. And so this, if you want, it's an intention to treat, but the outside the metropolitan France soldiers, these are entirely different regiments. And to be honest, it's even the records are kept in different places. So even in the death data, I don't have them. And, to the extent that they fight together or not, I think, again, what we see from the Battle of Verdun, for which we have a very precise timeline, it seems that they don't even serve together in Verdun very much. So you see, there's a few months at Verdun where I have no deaths in metropolitan French troops almost. And that's because the whole place is held by colonial troops. So this, anyway, I could talk about this for a long time. But another thing I want to say about military recruitment as well is that France authorities were worried about having this local recruitment. So after the revolution, there was this idea that it was important to mix troops from different regions of France to avoid the creation and the reinforcement and the arming of potentially strong regional identities. And then after the conflict with Prussia in 1870, or the German Empire, France, as you know, loses. And one of the theories that explains why they lost is that the fighting morals of the Germans were so much higher because they had this local regiment. So brothers were fighting with brothers, people from the same school were fighting together. And so France adopts this local recruitment system from Germany, even though the concern is that it would create these regional identities. So in fact, this is what we find in the paper. So I think, they were right to be worried. And in a sense, they were one war too late, because in World War I, fighting morale doesn't really matter because most people died by artillery fire. So this is the joke that I make, that France's high command is always one war too late in a way. But anyway, so one thing that's important to remember also about these regimental boundaries is that they sometimes they do, but often they do not correspond to departmental boundaries. And the department here is going to be the political district in the 1919 election. And I'm going to come back to this when we look at robustness. So this is the share of vote for the left in 1914. And so we're going to focus on the left because it is the new ideology, and because World War I is really changing the geographical map of France when it comes to the left-wing vote, and really corresponds, as I'll show you in a few slides, to the penetration of the rural areas with socialism. And I think it's important to say, again, for a European audience, maybe it's okay, but like these socialists, they're not hardcore Marxists that want to collectivize land. Like it's pretty much a social democrat ideology. And when they come into power, they don't do very radical things. Like they give people holidays, they raise minimum wage, they do this kind of things. They don't do, collectivization of land, right? So this is 1914, and then looking at the map, 4 years later, what we see even on the map, but more precisely in regression tables, is that we see really local homogenization within a regiment, but no uniformization around France. So this regression here are indices of polarization, political polarization in the 1919 election. Well, it's in the panel, so it's like comparing 1914 to 1919 with municipality fixed effects, or department fixed effect, or with geographical unit fixed effect. So what this is saying is that we don't see a change in political polarization either within a municipality or within a political district between 14 and 19, but we see a reduction of political polarization within a bureau. So this is really the story of conversion and homogenization within military recruitment bureau, so within a regiment, if you want. And so there's we have many ways of measuring polarization in the paper. So we can look at the distance between a municipality and the average of the regiment. We find that they converge. We can also find a reduction, like we can see that two municipalities will belong to the same regiment. They're not more similar to each other in 1914, but they become more similar to each other politically at the end of the war. So what explains, this convergence can be rationalized in a model of social interactions within a regiment, where people simultaneously choose whether to vote for the left or the right. And if we model this as strategic complements, this is a simple coordination game. And why would political vote be strategic complements? Well, that could be, because there is incentives to adopt similar political values. And in fact, in the appendix, we find that more homogeneous regiments, so regiments that are more homogeneous politically, do better at collective action. So we measure collective action by the probability of a mutiny, which is a very serious coordination game, because if you coordinate with the whole regiment, you're not gonna all get shot, but if you do it on your own, for sure you'll get shot, right? So we find that there is advantages, there is complementarity in the sense that they pay off and they enable collective action within the regiment to be more homogeneous politically. So what this simple model predicts really is homogenization of views within the regiment, but again, maybe differently from the whole nation building literature that says, do you become more French or less French? Here, there's two possible equilibria, or in fact, there's three. There's, if there is left and right, you can coordinate on the left or right. So you're going to have local homogenization, but at the global level, it's very unclear what's going to happen. And there may be cases where overall nationwide partisanship and polarization may appear unchanged or even increase. So this was the other ways to show the convergence. So what happens to partisanship? So, this is the regression table that shows you what I've already told you. So what we see is, it's not really this red wave. Like nationally, we don't see that the left makes a lot of progress nationally. It goes from a 16% average vote share to 21% nationally. But what we see is that we really see what was an urban movement spread to the countryside, right? So we see that if you look at the third column here, this is telling you that there is no progress of the socialists in urban areas, and all the progress come from rural areas. So in a way, the urban environment was already exposed to this information, but what happens in the trenches is a transmission of information to people from rural areas. And we see that nationally, this translates into this progress in poorer places of France and in more rural places of France. And I'll come back to this later. And this is not what you observe for mainstream parties. So the center and the right, you don't observe this heterogeneity because, they already knew what these parties were about. Was there a question?
Yeah, I have a question, Pauline. Sorry. Just can you clarify if you think so? Number one, how many people are dealt by a bureau, more or less? Because they're relatively large administrative units.
Yes, about 3,500.
And so can you say a little bit more about, how does, the fact that you're recruited in the same bureau, how does that affect the probability that you're actually together with people that you've never interacted with? Because it's like quite of a lot of municipalities. So how do people get then sent into barracks? To the front, like how's that process happening? And then from there, maybe because of that result you're presenting, can we see a heterogeneity depending on, how likely it is that within a bureau, you're more likely to be exposed to new urban ideas? You see what I mean? So some bureaus are going to be like a lot of cities and some are going to be in one big city. And yeah,
exactly. So I'll come back to this in the identification sample, in the ID sample, but just to have an idea. So like these bureaus, they're quite large areas. So it's true, but so they draw all the men from one place and then they assign them to a line infantry regiment or depending on your age, you're going to be in the line infantry or in the reserves or the reserve of the reserve. So again, we're focusing on the line infantry. And then these guys are moved together during the whole conflict. So the regiment is really the unit where you're moved together. And then so the way you rotate it at trench warfare is that you move with the whole regiment into a trench and you occupy the first line or the second line for, I don't know, 2 weeks or something. And then you rotate it at the back and you all rest together. And then when we come back to the magnitude of the results, I'll show you that our results are consistent with just the men from the line infantry being converted. So really the level of our treatment, and we don't need to rely on externalities to other people who were in other units or things like this to explain the magnitude of our results. So we really believe it's a story of you get assigned to a regiment that has a certain partisanship average, and then you convert to this average in the process that I'm going to tell you more in details about through this, intensity of peer effects during the war. And that's going to depend very much, as you already intuited, about the structure of the regiment. So we're going to find that conversion to socialism occurs precisely in the regiment that mix urban and rural troops.
Thanks.
Yeah. Can I ask a question on the voting system? So at that time in France, is it like these days when you have sort of countrywide proportional representation, or is it more like the UK system where you have districts and first past the post type of thing?
So it's a bit complicated, but so basically in 1919 in the election is in a department there is a list of candidates, and then depending on the population of the department, more than like several candidates gets elected. So it's MPs, right? So you elect member of parliament that represent your district.
Thanks.
Okay, so why do we focus on the left? I mean, as I said, because it's really the new non-mainstream party at the time, and it's really the what is becoming the structuring force in France in the post-war era. So when I mean the socialist, I mean the French section of the Workers' International. It was created in 1905, and it really united Marxists and social democrats. And in fact, we have, so this movement splits in 1920. And so it's really the same party in 1914 and 1920. And the split in 1920 is really about like how to align with the Bolshevik Revolution. And what we see is that it's really, again, the more urban base, like the more urban Marxist base on the movement who creates the Communist Party, and the SFIO who remains mostly social democrats. And where we're going to see all the results I'm telling you about the left is specific to the SFIO. So it's not the communists. If anything, in 1919, there is a small marginal group that calls themselves the communists, but they're not the main communist party, who will be created in 1920. So they don't vote more for these communist ideals. And then after 1920, it's really specific to the SFIO. So again, I don't want you to think that these guys are extreme Marxists. And we see that when they split over how to support the Bolshevik Revolution, we see that what I'm going to talk to you about remains for the socialists, but not the Communist Party. So what I mean by they're not a mainstream idea is that if we look at the average vote share for the left in the regiment in 1914, we have this very skewed distribution where we have a few places with very high vote share for the left, for the socialists, and this is mostly urban places, and then a large number of municipalities in France where there is no vote for the left, and this is mostly urban, rural area. And so here the vertical bar is actually the mean vote share, so you can see that it's very skewed distribution. So what we're gonna, and then other parties, so like, and more mainstream party, you see it's a much more normal distribution. So the left is this new political force that's going to become very polarized. And there's also many reasons to think that it left a strong local imprint in the line regiment. So if you want to think about our paper, it's really this idea that in the regiment, this is really where the hammer, the industrial worker, met and converted the sickle, the peasants, through these socialist ideas. And there's even memoirs of infantrymen who say that the industrial workers brought with them and left as an inheritance many of their distinctive traits, including a sharp feeling for the collective. So these guys really bring new ideas like sharing the packages that your mom or your wife sent you. So before, they described that these packages were only shared with people from the same village. And then the socialists, they said, hey, hang on a minute, why don't we share across the whole unit? So instead of having, so many cigarettes that then get wet in the trench, we share, and then you always have dry cigarettes. And they're like, oh, this is brilliant. We never thought about this before. So this is what this guy describes. Like, it's almost a new mindset of having this collective idea and, and feeling and like redistribution. So what we want to, so this kind of the protocol thing is that, so the authorities were very concerned about these socialists converting troops in the trenches. And so initially they're like, oh, all these dangerous pacifists and trade unionists, we're not going to send them to war. But because they needed men so badly, they still, send them. So we're trying to collect data on where the most dangerous individuals were, but we're not done yet. So what we consider here is, the idea is to estimate the conversion power to this new ideology is to find municipalities, mostly in rural areas, that had never been exposed to the left, so where the initial vote share for the left was very, very low, but end up in regiments that differ partly in their political composition. So, one of these places ends up in a left-wing regiment with a lot of socialists. The other one ends up in a non-socialist regiment. So this is we approximate this with an RD design where we're going to look at all the possible. So if you remember the map with all these boundaries, we're going to look at a huge data set for every municipality. You're potentially, on the side of one of all these borders. And we're going to see whether you're, what the impact on political preferences to be assigned to a regiment that differs in their partisanship composition. So what we estimate is an RD at the municipality military boundary level, where we regress the share of vote for the left in 1919 in municipality I close to regimental boundary B on whether this municipality is assigned on the side of the boundary that it's allocated to a left-wing regiment, which we define as the treatment. And the base definition of this is kind of the vertical line I showed you. You're either allocated to regiments where there is a higher than national mean share of socialists or not. And I'll show you robustness to this and the result of a fuzzy RD that takes into account the jump at the border in the socialist vote share. So then there's a set of dummy variables for each boundary. So you're either on the right-wing side of the border or the left-wing side of the border. And we estimate these multiple discontinuities across all the possible different boundaries between regiments. So of course, the dimension that here, I put 435, the dimensionality is much reduced because, sometimes the treatment doesn't vary. So we find that the treatment status varies across 100 of potential boundaries in the map that I showed you. And then we control, because we have this very high dimensional data, we control for RD polynomials that controls for smooth functions of geographic location around each boundary. So, you know, if I approach the boundary from the left, I want this to be estimated separately than if I approach it from the right. And then if a municipality is close to two boundaries, I also want this to be estimated separately for the side of each relevant boundary. With cluster standard error two ways at the municipality and boundary level. And again, yeah, I mean, we can get into the details, and then we consider different bandwidth. I mean, it's impossible to compute an optimal bandwidth in this setup because this is this multiple cutoff setting, but we boil this down to a more simple RD, and the optimal bandwidth is 11 Ks. And so we're going to consider a bandwidth of 10 Ks in most of our specification. So this is to show you that there is no discontinuity at these borders in terms of a number of covariates. So this is not exactly the same problem as I've just showed you, but you know, I don't have time to go into the details, but or I can show you in a regression format that we look at the share of left in 1914, World War I death rate, population in 1911, size of the municipality, and whether they're rotated to big important battles of World War I, including the Marne battle, Verdun under Pétain, because you know we have this other paper that shows that that might matter for political preferences, or the Somme. So we don't see any discontinuity. And then we have a number of other outcomes. So all of these other outcomes, they're measures less precisely, but we don't see any outcome in any differences in outcome in other covariates. So this is the vote share for the left in 1914. There is no discontinuity. And then we see this jump in 1919. And in regression format, estimating what I've just showed you before, we see that exposure to a left-wing regiment is associated with a significant increase in the share of vote for the left in 1919. And that comes really at the expense of this more centrist movement. And as I said, like this is robust to differentiating, like looking at vote shares instead of log farms. I mean, we don't have any zeros, right? So there is never a zero vote share. So logs is not really an issue in this setup, but it's robustness to shares. And then we can have a fuzzy RD and estimate with, so the estimates that we obtain are that exposure to left-wing regiment implies a 26 to 37% higher vote share for the left. This seems like a big number, but it's from a very low base. And actually, when we recover the number of men in the election that explains our effect, it's consistent with the veterans from the line infantry coming back and voting for the left. So this seems a big effect, but it's from a very low base. So it's, you know, it's not that big of an effect, basically. So in terms of robustness, you know, we do a large number of things. I think the most interesting things here is that we don't find, so, you know, I showed you the map and sometimes it corresponds to department boundaries and sometimes it doesn't. So we do three things to address this. So first of all, we look at whether there is a differential effect at borders that coincide with political district borders and doesn't. We find that the effect is robust to department fixed effect. And then what we do is that we do the same RD at the level of department. So I consider that you're allocated to a left-wing political district if you belong to a political district in 1914 that's more left-wing than the national average. And then what happens in 1919, there is no discontinuity at this department borders when they do not correspond to the regimental boundaries borders. I think an interesting test is that we do this for different initial vote shares for the left. So on average, we look at people where the initial vote share for the left is less than 3%, which is 50% of all municipalities. So it's really these rural municipalities. We vary this initial threshold from 1% to 6%, and it's robust. But what we see is that in terms of magnitude, the effect goes down as you increase the initial vote share for the left. So this is consistent with an information setup where if you already knew about the left, the treatment effects and the share of vote for the left was initially bigger, you see a smaller conversion. When we see no jump in other outcomes, and then, you know, we also do some robustness through the specification. Okay, so in terms of mechanism, what's going on? So going back to the model, you could see this convergence, meaning either conformity, that is, you want to imitate the majority voting in your regiment, or learning and information. So you learn about the platform of this new party, and then you adopt it if it corresponds to your needs. So we're going to find evidence more consistent with the second one. So how do we do this? The first thing we do is that we look at the same treatment if you're exposed to a right-wing regiment or if you're exposed to a centrist regiment. So we find if you're exposed to a center regiment, you become more center. So this would be consistent with conformism. But if you're exposed to a right-wing regiment, and again, what I mean by right-wing here, these guys are monarchists, right? So these are not people who are aligned with the material interests of the peasantry in France. They basically want to reestablish the monarchy. So the guys who are exposed to the right, what happens is that they don't become more right because they're not completely crazy, but they're inoculated against the left. So what you see in those, you see a decrease in vote share for the left and more to the center. And so we rationalize this by inoculation of the right against the left. So the idea is that this right-wing guy, they say, these socialists, they're very dangerous. Look, they will kill your priest again, like they did in the revolution. And look what's going on in Russia. This is 1917, And so they scare them against the left. So we see that this is inconsistent with conformism. It's not just they adopt the political values, they adapt to the material needs and the information. So then we provide more evidence on this. So our conversion to the left, the idea is that the ideology of the left should be particularly attractive when it corresponds to material needs. And so that's what we found. We found more conversion in poorer municipalities and in more agricultural municipalities. And I've already showed this, that consistent with the information channel, we find more, like the treatment effect is higher in municipalities where the share of vote for the left initially was lower. So then to go back to Valeria's comment, we look exactly at the level of urban-rural mixing in the regiment. So we construct this from the standard deviation of the type of place that the municipality is. So this is an index from 1 to 4, if you're a village, 2 if you're a small town, 3 if you're a suburb of a large town, of a large city, and 4 if you're a city. And so to give you an example, I don't know how many of you went to France and went to visit Bar-le-Duc, but this is a really rural area. There is nothing to see there, so probably you haven't been there. And so this is where we find the lower level of urban-rural mix because it's basically 95% villages. It's very rural, so there's no urban guys there. The place with the higher rural-urban mix is a place that you probably have been to, so it's Versailles in the outskirts of Paris, and so this is clearly bringing people from the metropolitan Paris area with people from the countryside. And so this is where we find the higher urban-rural mix. So we find that the treatment effect is higher in regiments where there is more urban-rural mix. We also find that the treatment effect is higher in regiments where officers come from more left-wing places. So we build an index that reflects the political values of the place where the officers come from. And then we find that in regiments where officers came more from left-wing places, there is more conversion to the left. And actually, we use a very interesting change in the identity and the nature of military leadership after 1914 to refine this transmission from officers mechanism. So as I was working on this, I was listening to a podcast by a historian called Saint-Fucien who explains so his whole thesis and his whole book is about the fact that what happened is that in 1914, French officers, they were career officers, and these guys really inherited the mentality of Napoleon and the revolution. So they were standing there in their red pants with their feathers on their helmets, and they had to die standing up. So this was the idea of grandeur of the career officers in the French army. You had to die. It would be shameful to bow against the enemy, so you had to die standing up. And in fact, the death rates among career officers in 1914 is much higher than regular troops, because regular troops have no problem going down, but like an officer is not possible. So these guys get killed at a high rate. And because the first few months of 1914 are such a disaster for France, if they don't get killed, a lot of them get fired. Then as they get fired or killed, you need to replace these guys. And who do you replace them with? You replace them with reserve officers who are, in fact, people who have enough education, and a lot of them are teachers. So teachers is the second profession with the highest death rates in World War I after career officers. And the reason for that is that they become the reserve officers. So we verify in the data that officers who die in 1914, who are the career officer, they tend to come from conservative, not socialist places, less socialist than the average of the district, But the reserve officers, so the officers who die after 1914, they come from more socialist places than the average of the district. And all that story of transmission of socialist value, it comes only from officers who die after 1914 and nothing from the officers who die in 1914 and who are these conservative career officers. Okay, so I need to fast forward a bit and maybe I'll just show you some pictures for the last bit of the paper. So this table, what it shows you is that it shows you that the effects that I described last, in the 1936 election, again, to explain the vote for the SFIO, but not the communists. And then after the war, it persists for a while, but it becomes much smaller. And, that's partly explained with the fact that, women vote after World War II, and contrary to what you might think, women may not necessarily vote in the same way as their husbands. That's a joke. This was the joke about female suffrage. They would be useless because they would vote like their husbands. It seems that not so much. But so we find that, the effect persists a bit after the war, very much attenuated. And it's borderline significant, until 1980, 1988 election. But then post-1990, it's basically zero. Right. So it's really this timing that lasts. I mean, maybe it's because they all die, right? It's possible. I don't know exactly where you see it fading away, but it's interesting to see that it lasts pretty much the time that left-right structure French politics. But, go back to this one in 1936. What happens is that you have these local discontinuities that you didn't have before. So on that side of the military boundary, these guys are socialists. On this side, they're not. And then the 30s is just this tragic polarization that degenerates. And this is, the left hates the right hates the left. And if you live close to people who are not of your political opinion, it's going to not be very nice. This is essentially the story of the rest of the paper. So historians have described France's long civil war that starts on February 6, 1934, with the assault of right-wing extremists on the parliament to prevent the investiture of a newly elected left-wing government. Maybe that reminds you of more recent event that also happened on the 6th of the month. And then in 1936, you have this election of this Jewish socialist prime minister, Léon Blum, and everybody, the right hates him. They try to kill him. It doesn't work. And when you have the collaborationist government in place in 1940, they arrest him, put him in prison, and then deport him to Buchenwald and Dachau. And honestly, deportation to a concentration camp is what saves this guy's life. His ministers of his government, who are also arrested and imprisoned, they're actually shot by the paramilitary collaborationist group, the milice in France, as well as Léon Blum's brother, this guy is a famous conductor. He comes back from the US to be with his family. He's arrested and he's deported to Auschwitz, and he's killed on arrival in Auschwitz. But this Léon Blum is more important, and so the Germans actually took better care of him in the concentration camp that the French paramilitary forces did with members of this government. Okay, so France in 1930s is not, is divided, and this division, they're very much linked to the, discussions about the defeat in France and the willingness to put in place this authoritarian government. So there is a lot of historical narrative about the fact that it is because there was so much polarization that the French right and the elite were very happy, and some elites were very happy to have this authoritarian government, which finally was going to crack down on the socialists, and which is very much what they did. So we have data on resistance and collaboration during World War II. And there is really this aspect described by historians that resistance and collaboration is also very much about internal fighting in France and settling the score of this political division inherited from that lasted for the 30s. So the question here is, were these internal divisions inherited from World War I drive collaboration and resistance? And the way we test it is that we're going to try and see whether there is more collaboration and resistance in places that are close to these divided military boundaries. Okay, so I don't have all the time to show you all the pictures, but so this is the data on collaborators, and then we have 100,000 of them. We have data on 600,000 recognized members of the resistance. And one thing that's interesting maybe to keep in mind for our result is that Among the collaborators, there's people who worked directly for the SS or the Gestapo. I mean, not so many of them. There are people who joined fascist parties, and there is people who joined paramilitary forces in France, in particular the milice, who gets their weapon from the Gestapo, and their job is to kill resistance members and find Jews, basically. In the resistance, you also have different groups. And so in particular, you have civilian resistance, who are the people who join fighting groups in the resistance. And you also have people in our data, we also have people who are the victim of Nazi repression. So this is people that, the Nazi killed or deported because they did stuff against German occupation forces. Okay, I don't really have time to go into the detail, but I'm going to tell you a little story about two towns, Belley, which is here in the Jura department, and Annemasse in Haute-Savoie. And so there's, I could tell you many reasons about why I chose these two towns, but it's basically because, my family is from there, and I was on the train to Geneva. And so, I was like, I don't know, let's see what town would match Belley. And so I found Annemasse. So these towns are like pretty small towns, and there's like they never heard about the left before. In 1914, there is 0.1% vote share for the left in Belley, 0.3% in Annemasse. These are rural places. They never heard about the left. So this is what the distribution of local votes looked like in 1914. And so Annemasse gets assigned to this regiment where there is no socialist. Belley gets assigned to this regiment here. And there is all these socialists here because there's a river here with some proto-industries. And so as a result, Belley gets assigned to a more left-wing regiment than Annemasse. And this is what happens to the share of votes in 1919. So the share of votes is like twice as much in 1919 in Belley than it is for Annemasse. And when we look at collaboration and resistance, the reason also why I chose these two towns is that these are really like a hotbed of resistance and collaboration activities during World War II, because Vichy is close by, and this is like the escape networks going to Switzerland, where there's a lot of Jews that try to escape to Switzerland. It's a mountainous terrain, so there is a lot of resistance activity. So, this is also why these two towns are interesting, because this is a really hotbed of collaboration and resistance in World War II. And this is what we find. We find that in both places, there is a lot more resistance members and collaborators compared to the national average, but there is also overrepresentation of people who are in paramilitary forces. And so Belley is the left-wing place. And so we find that compared to Annemasse, they have more resistance members. And we have a lot more collaborators in Annemasse, the right-wing place, compared to Belley. So, in regression form, what we find is that there is more collaboration where you're closer to these divided boundaries that is inherited from, World War I political divisions. You have more collaborators, you have more resistance members. And when we look at this shows you that you tend to have more resistance on the left side of the border, more collaboration on the right side of the border. But when we look at like what the resistance activity consists of, attentat is direct attacks against German soldiers, so they don't seem to be doing that. What they do is that they do more sabotage and they do more fires. And so this is basically, they destroy more civilian targets, and they're, setting fires to the farm of their neighbors and the people they don't like, rather than attacking German soldiers. So this is consistent with this, score settling against internal division that may have been inherited partly from the local divisions that were created by regimental assignment in World War I. I'm done. So, what to retain from this? I think what's interesting from this paper is that we study this process of political realignment in the context where there is this new and polarizing political force. We find that information and material needs explain this political realignment and the spread of this ideology from urban to rural areas. So it is consistent with recent work that looks at the media and so, information technology, and also the role of material conditions in explaining the rise of the far right. And, more specifically to the spread of socialism, there's actually a couple of papers, but limited to China, where they find the role of propaganda in converting elites. So our work is very complementary because we're looking at the spread from the elite to the peasants. And there's also work that look at the role of the war, and so the role of nationalism. And so again, our mechanism is very different from that. It's not the role of like fighting against the occupation against Japan in the context of China. It's really about the ideological spread that responds to people's local material needs. And then I guess, one takeaway from this paper is that local polarization and segregation can indeed turn violent when people have access to weapons, which is, for us in the context of World War II. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Great. So how about questions from the audience? We still have several minutes. Are there any questions, Valeria? Oh, no, that's a clapping hand. I have a question. I don't know if this is any good question, but you mentioned that there is this over time, there's this slowly the whole this whole influence sort of disappears, but it did last for a good part of the 20th century ultimately. So the question is, is this because of the people who die out, or is this because of some local
yeah. So
and another question that is somewhere in there, so maybe closer to data related, is it possible to identify people who sort of by age, not only whether rural, but people who went to trenches? That's 20 cohorts, 20 years between 18 and did you say 48? I believe.
Yeah.
38. I don't remember.
Yes. So I can answer your second question. We don't have division by age in the municipality. So in fact, the census at the municipal level, which is this very small unit, until the 1960s gives very little information. We only have population. We don't even have number of men and women. We back that out from the registered voters who give us the number of voting people who are men. But so the age structure, we can't know. And so this is leading to your first point. Do you see this effect fading out because they die, or maybe because political parties start talking about something else, right? And I don't know, but it's still interesting to see that these two phenomena are co-happening, right? And so again, it's still interesting to see that this is, political parties start to talk about something else as these people die and as our effect is no longer discernible in the data. So
yes, thank you. We have a question, Sri Chan.
Thank you, Pauline, for a very interesting presentation. So I'm just wondering that did the soldiers recruited before World War I always go back to their original place, or could they choose to move to other places? So I'm just wondering whether the effects you identify in your main analysis could be due to some dispersion of the ideology of those soldiers.
Yeah. So thanks very much for your question. And it enables me to talk about a result that I haven't talked to you about. So first of all, you vote in 1919 in the municipality where you're registered. Yeah. And, of course, people are going to move after World War I, but this is demobilization. These guys, they haven't seen their wives, their kids, their mothers for 5 years. So I think they are going to move ultimately. And I think this is also contributing to the effect fading away over time because these people move. But in 1919, again, so what enables me to discuss this with more evidence is, first of all, the descriptive stat that I gave you. I think it's quite powerful. It's like 180, then it's 150. It's a difference of 30 men, which happens to the average death rate. So this is really consistent with these people coming back to where they are. But then we can more formally test that by looking at turnout. Right. So turnout basically gives you the percentage of vote expressed as a percentage of registered voters who are still alive. And so we don't find any differences in turnout driven by our differential exposure.
Okay.
And we can't measure migration in any other way. So again, municipality to municipality migration is just impossible.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Yeah.
And I noticed that Yves Zenou is with us. Hi, Yves. I recognize you now.
I will see you soon.
Yeah. Southampton.
Yeah, and I'm not in Australia. Otherwise, it would be night. I am in Abu Dhabi, which is only 3 hours different. Otherwise, it would be night in And also, Pauline is not in Australia, obviously.
Yeah, we've already discussed this. You can see her window behind her. It's a real window and it's still light.
Yeah.
We have 1 minute more of official time. Is there any other question?
I have one minute question. I was curious whether you wanted to explore also the roles of the demand for the welfare state, and in particular, the increase in people who are disabled and who are going to need support after the war, and if there's any heterogeneity in that.
Yeah, so that would be interesting. That would be very interesting. So we have data on deaths, and we don't find any heterogeneity by the death rate at the municipal level. What we don't have is data on, wounded.
Disability, I thought there was there. Okay, thanks.
No, so it's really fatality data. But if you assume that casualties are going to be correlated with fatalities overall, it seems that you would pick something up with the heterogeneity in the death rate, but we don't really find it. But I think that's a good question, And I think also to come back to this heterogeneity in the death rate, I think that was related to an earlier question, and this is related to what we've studied in the other paper. It's surprising, like how the death rate is maintained. So we look at an analysis of the death rate with rotation to major battles, and in particular, the Verdun battle that lasts for a long time, and it really seems that they are rotating troops in a way so as to maintain death rates, across units. So it's not the story of like one region, one unit gets decimated. And so, yeah. So, and you see like there is, in our RD sample, there is perfect continuity of the death rate across the border. So us not picking any variation, may also be due to the fact that there is no variation in the death rate across this. So yeah, I don't really know, but we don't find anything. Yeah.
All right, thank you very much. Let's stop here with the official part. So